The salt-laced wind off the Atlantic was a familiar, biting friend to Agios Sophia, but this was different. This was a Nova Scotian wind, colder and carrying a deeper, more ancient sorrow. It whipped at the collar of his trench coat as he stood on the pitching deck of the chartered fishing boat, his gaze fixed on the island clawing its way out of the grey sea. Perched atop it like a shard of bone was the lighthouse, St. Jude's Folly. Mandy stood beside him, her hand tucked into the crook of his arm, a small anchor in the churning world. Her usually vibrant face was pale, her red hair a slash of defiance against the bruised canvas of the sky. "It doesn't look right, Augie," she murmured, her voice nearly stolen by the gale. He grunted in agreement. Agios, a man whose body was a roadmap of scars from a life spent falling off buildings for cinema, had a keen instinct for things that were fundamentally wrong. A malfunctioning lighthouse was a mechanical problem. This felt pathological. St. Jude's Folly wasn't just broken, it was sick. 4 ships in 3 months had been dashed against its granite teeth, despite the light supposedly being manned and operational. Lloyd's of London was getting nervous, and their nervousness paid well. The boatman, a grizzled local named Cormac, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the waves. "They say bad luck clings to that rock like lichen," he told them back in port. "The keeper, Silas, he's a strange one. Took the post last fall. Never comes ashore." As they drew closer, the sickness of the place became more apparent. The white paint of the tower was flaking, revealing stone stained with dark greenish streaks that looked disturbingly organic. The waves that crashed against the island's base weren't a clean, frothy white, but a murky, bilious gray-green, and they seemed to claw at the rock rather than simply break upon it. The landing was a treacherous dance between the heaving boat and a slick, weed-choked jetty. Cormac wished them luck with the grim finality of a man seeing them off to the gallows, promising to return in 2 days. Then he was gone, a sputtering engine fading into the oppressive mist, leaving them alone with the groaning sea and the silent tower. Figure emerged from the doorway at the base of the lighthouse. He was tall and gaunt, wrapped in a heavy wool coat, his face a mask of shadows beneath a watch. "Cap. Mr. Sophia? I'm Silas, the keeper." His voice was a dry rasp, like stones grinding together. Agios felt a cold spike of unease, a flicker of something deeply, horribly familiar. He shook the offered hand. The skin was cold and clammy, with a faint briny odor that went beyond the smell of the sea. It was the smell of a stagnant tide pool, of things left too long in the deep dark. "Mandy," Agios said, gesturing to his companion. "My assistant." Silas's eyes, pale and depthless as a winter sky, lingered on Mandy for a fraction too long. A smile touched his thin lips, a brief, unsettling gesture. "Welcome to St. Jude's. It's a lonely post. Company is a rare delicacy." He led them inside. The interior was damp and cold, the air thick with the smell of brine, kerosene, and something else, something musky and ancient. Strange, spiraling symbols were faintly visible on the damp stone walls, half scrubbed away but still potent. They looked less like carvings and more like the tracks of some boneless, slug-like creature. "The damp gets into everything," Silas explained, noticing Agios's gaze. "Even the stone." He showed them to a small, Spartan guest room. A single, salt-fuzzed window looked out onto the churning sea. As Mandy set down their bags, Agios leaned closer to the windowpane, wiping away the grime. The rocks below were jagged and black, but in the churning surf, he thought he saw movement. Something slick and dark, too large and purposeful to be a seal, slipping beneath a wave. He blinked and it was gone. "Dinner in an hour," Silas's voice rasped from the doorway, making them both jump. He was gone as silently as he had appeared. "I don't like this, Augie," Mandy whispered, her arms wrapped around herself. "I don't like him. There's something about his voice." "I know," Agios said, the feeling of familiarity gnawing at him. "It's like a bell you can't quite unring." Dinner was a tense affair in the keeper's small kitchen. Silas served them a thick, pungent stew of fish and dark sea vegetables. It tasted of the deep ocean, of salt and iodine and a faint coppery tang that turned Agios's stomach. Through the meal, Silas spoke of the sea not as a body of water, but as a living entity. "She has moods," he rasped, staring into the flickering flame of the oil lamp. "And an appetite. She provides for me, and I provide for her. A simple arrangement." He looked up, and his pale eyes caught the lamplight. It was then that Agios saw it. Not just the eyes, but the predatory stillness, the particular tilt of the head, the way the thin lips stretched into that bloodless smile. The memories came rushing back, not of sight, but of sound and shadow. A voice from a darkened alley, a silhouette against a burning warehouse, and the chilling, omnipresent horror of the mist that had swallowed their town of Samhain last summer. The mist from which this man had vanished. The stew turned to lead in Agios' gut. The room seemed to shrink, the sound of the waves outside becoming a hungry rhythmic chant. Samoth, Agios breathed, his hand instinctively going to the weighted sap in his coat pocket. The keeper's smile widened, a truly terrible sight. It was a predator's smile, full of ancient malice. He slowly, deliberately, removed his watch cap. The gaunt face was the same, but crueler, etched with lines that spoke of pacts made in abyssal depths. "So you do remember," Samoth said, his voice shedding its gravelly disguise, becoming smoother, colder, and infinitely more menacing. "I was beginning to think the salt air had addled that stuntman's brain of yours. I prefer Silas now. It has a certain finality to it." Mandy gasped, her chair scraping against the stone floor as she pushed back. "But you were gone." The mist was a door," Samoth purred, his eyes gleaming. "For some, an exit. For me, an introduction. I was drowning in its grey embrace when they found me. They offered me a new life, a new purpose. All they ask for in return is a flock to shepherd." A low, mournful horn blast echoed from the sea, cutting through the howl of the wind. A ship, lost in the worsening storm. Samoth rose from his chair, his movements unnaturally fluid. "Ah, the evening's entertainment. You'll have to excuse me. The light requires my attention." He turned to a heavy, iron-strapped door. Before Agios could move, Samoth slammed it shut. The heavy thud of a beam sliding into place echoed through the kitchen. They were trapped. "What is he doing?" Mandy cried, rushing to the door and pulling at the unyielding handle. Agios was already at the kitchen's small, grimy porthole. He wiped it clean and peered out. The storm had descended in full force, a maelstrom of wind and rain. Out in the blackness, he could see the lights of a steam freighter, battling the waves, desperately seeking the guidance of the lighthouse. He looked up. The great lamp at the top of the tower was supposed to cast a single sweeping beam. But it wasn't. Instead, Agios watched in dawning horror as a series of smaller, focused beams began to flicker from the lantern room. Samoth wasn't dousing the light, he was using it. With a complex array of shutters and mirrors, he was creating a false channel, a shimmering pathway of light that led not to the safety of the open sea, but directly towards the jagged, ship-breaking rocks on the far side of the island. "He's guiding them into the reef," Agios said, his voice flat with horror. The freighter, trusting the light, turned its bow. It was a lamb to the slaughter. The sound when it came was a gut-wrenching symphony of destruction, the tortured scream of tearing metal, the deep-throated crack of a hull breaking its spine on ancient stone, and then faintly the cries of men. Mandy stifled a scream, her face buried in Agios' shoulder. But the horror was only beginning. "Look," Agios whispered, his voice trembling. From the churning dark water around the dying ship, figures began to emerge. They were not men. They were tall, stooped, with slick gray-green skin that glistened in the storm. Their heads were piscine, with wide, unblinking, luminous eyes. Webbed claws scrabbled at the broken hull of the freighter, pulling themselves aboard with a terrifying, inhuman agility. The faint cries of the sailors turned from panic to shrieks of pure, unadulterated terror as the deep ones fell upon them. It wasn't a rescue. It was a harvest. Agios and Mandy could only watch, paralyzed, as the figures dragged screaming men, both living and dead, from the wreckage and slipped back beneath the waves. The sea frothed and churned, stained dark. In minutes, there was only the storm, the wreckage, and a horrifying, sated silence. The beam slid back from the kitchen door. Samoth stood there, wiping his hands on a rag. His face was alight with a rapturous, holy ecstasy. "A beautiful tithe, wouldn't you agree?" he said calmly. "They are so very grateful. They saved me, and now I serve them. I am the shepherd of St. Jude's. I bring the lost home." The ex-stuntman in Agios finally broke through the paralysis. He launched himself at Samoth, rage giving him a strength born of desperation. But Samoth was no longer just a man. He moved with a liquid speed, sidestepping Agios' charge and sending him stumbling with a simple, effortless shove. There was a strength in him that was not human, a gift from his abyssal gods. "Oh, Agios," he sighed, a hint of pity in his tone. "You always choose the most direct, foolish path. You and your lovely assistant were to be the dessert. A special offering." From the shadows of the corridor behind Samoth, a low gurgling sound echoed. Two of the fish-like horrors shuffled into the light, their luminous eyes fixing on Agios and Mandy. They reeked of brine and blood, and the air grew thick and hard to breathe. "Time for the final service," Samoth said, gesturing towards them. Mandy acted first. Snatching the heavy cast-iron skillet from the stove, she swung it with all her might, catching one of the creatures square in the side of its bulbous head. There was a wet, sickening crunch, and the thing stumbled, gurgling in surprise and pain. The distraction was all Agios needed. He didn't charge Samoth again. He grabbed a chair and hurled it not at the man, but at the large oil lamp on the table. It shattered, sending a wave of burning kerosene across the stone floor. Flames erupted, catching on the tapestries and the dry wood of the furniture. Samoth hissed, backing away from the fire. "You fools. You'll bring the whole tower down. Better than being your offering." Agios yelled, grabbing Mandy's hand. He saw their only escape, the small, grimy kitchen porthole. It was impossibly small. A stuntman's gambit. While the deep ones recoiled from the flames, and Samoth was momentarily occupied with the spreading fire, Agios worked frantically at the porthole hinges. They were rusted solid. He pulled the heavy sap from his pocket and hammered at them, the metal screaming in protest. "Agi, they're coming." Mandy cried. One of the creatures lunged through the flames, its webbed claws reaching. Agios shoved Mandy behind him and met the charge, driving his shoulder into its chest. They crashed against the wall, the creature's fetid breath hot on his face. Its strength was immense, its claws digging into his coat. With a final desperate blow, the hinge pin shattered. Agios wrenched the porthole open. Cold, spray-filled air flooded the smoke-filled kitchen. "Go," he roared at Mandy. "Get to the boat." Mandy squeezed through the opening, her face streaked with soot and terror. Agios slammed his elbow into the creature's gill-like neck, forcing it to release him for a second, and scrambled after her. He tumbled out onto the narrow stone ledge, gasping in the storm-tossed air. Below, their small boat bobbed violently at the jetty. They had to get to it. They began to scramble down the slick, treacherous rocks as the kitchen window behind them glowed like a malevolent orange eye. Then the main beam of the lighthouse swung around, catching them in its brilliant, blinding glare. At the top of the tower, silhouetted against the great lamp, stood Samoth. He wasn't trying to stop them. He was laughing. A high, unhinged sound that was swallowed by the storm but felt as if it drilled directly into their skulls. Clawed hands erupted from the churning surf around the jetty, grasping for the boat. More of the creatures were rising from the depths, drawn by their master's call. "No time." Agios yelled. He didn't climb down to the jetty, he judged the distance to the boat's deck, a stunt he hadn't performed in years. He leaped. He landed hard, his ankle twisting, pain shooting up his leg, but he was in. He turned and reached for Mandy, pulling her aboard just as a webbed claw swiped at her leg. He fumbled with the engine, his hands shaking. The creatures were swarming the jetty, some slipping into the water, their sleek forms moving frighteningly fast towards them. The engine coughed, sputtered, and finally caught with a roar. Agios slammed the throttle, and the boat lurched away from the island, away from St. Jude's Folly. He risked one last look back. The fire was spreading, smoke and flame now licking at the windows of the lantern room itself. But through the chaos, the great light still swept across the sea, a beacon of damnation. And at its heart, he could still see the silhouette of Samoth, a priest in his burning temple. Unmoving, watching them go, as if letting them escape was all part of a much larger, more terrible plan. The bad luck of St. Jude's Folly hadn't been cast out, it had simply been given a face.